Okay, good morning, everybody. Let's get started with our next session. I'm Candace Shoemaker, and I'm one of the members of the organizing committee, and I also want to say my personal welcome to all of you. I think so far with the welcome reception last night and in the morning session this morning, we're off to a really, really good start. If you've looked at the schedule, you can see we have a lot of, like our breaks are pretty long and our lunch, because we really want everyone to be networking and talking, and I can see that that's happening, so it's wonderful. It's my great, first I want to just point out, these aren't just something that we made up. This is the responses that you gave us this morning to our first question. So, you know, it's kind of funny that urban is the biggest one. I guess you got the idea that this is about urban food systems. But I also love that the other major word is learn. And that is something that we really want to have happen in the next 3 days during this experience for all of us. So we're all learning from each other. You know, this is a relatively new idea, the idea of urban food systems. And I think Julian really set the stage for us this morning on how important the urban setting is going to be to feed the future. And so we need to learn. We need to figure out how we're going to do this. And so this is wonderful. So with that, it's my privilege to introduce our next speaker. And this is someone that I actually heard a few years ago in the Netherlands at a European conference on urban agriculture. And very inspiring to me, and I remembered that, and I actually used a lot that I learned from him in my classes that I teach in urban food systems. So our next speaker is Ken Meter, and he is one of the most experienced food system analysts in the U.S. today. His work integrates market analysis, business development, systems thinking, and social concerns. And that's really a lot of what we do in our urban food systems program. So it's just perfect. Ken is the president of Crossroads Resource Center, which is a nonprofit organization that works with communities and their allies to foster democracy and local self-determination. And through this work, Ken has developed a lot of different tools for communities to use. And some of these are national models for analyzing rural economies. And these tools have been adopted by regions all over the country, many different states, as well as in Canada. Ken is a contributing editor to the Journal of Agriculture, Food Systems, and Community Development. He also writes occasionally for Successful Farming Magazine, Edible Twin Cities, Grist, and Cooking Up a Story. And he also is a teacher with the University of Minnesota and Harvard Kennedy School, and teaches economic history of U.S. agriculture and microeconomics. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken. Please welcome Ken.
Microphone check, and people hear me okay? I've been given permission to be sort of a free-range speaker today, and so we'll see if that works well or not. And I have to kind of watch the monitor to see where I am in my presentation, so I'll be looking away from you from time to time. But I'm really happy to be here. I've had a chance to do some studies in the northeast of Kansas in the last few years, doing an economic analysis of the farm and food economy here, and I have lots of colleagues here who are carrying that work forward, and it's really nice to come back and see what's moving forward since I was here. I'm also going to do a slightly different speech than I typically do, because a new book has come out called Sowing the Seeds of the City, which has a chapter that I wrote in it, and I decided to put that chapter to slides just to give me some new spin on some of the material I usually talk about. So we'll have a little adventure today and try some new things out, and hopefully that's going to work well for you. The first slide I want to show is actually the location in Hopi. As a lot of you know, Hopi has been having agriculture continuously for about 4,000 years on the North American continent. And so I thought it would be good to show a slide of people have a very interesting construct for food. They actually grew food because people nearby needed to eat. It's something we wouldn't do anymore today because we have these fancy economic models that help us decide where to grow food and agriculture. And I use this as an example of urban agriculture because I really want to focus on the peri-urban qualities of agriculture and also the fact that this connection between consumers and farmers is really critical to our sense of survival here. In a way, you can't really call this an urban area, but it was where people lived, and people lived because they found some soil nearby that they could farm. This was the soil they found. It's been abandoned for a number of years, but some people, including Gary Nabbitt in Arizona, have actually tried to bring these fields back into production. I've looked at some fields like this in Hopi and wondered how people do it and had my guide say, this is beautiful soil. And he talked about the fact that the water was moving 12 inches below the surface, and so it didn't get evaporated away, but it was there for the plants. And the way people knew those intimate things about soil has been succeeding for 4,000 years on the North American continent. And I'm actually going to, in my speech, talk a lot about the history of urban agriculture, the kind of history of what we have done in the past, and also hopefully some good signposts for the future as well. But I think if you can raise food in this setting with a small population, it should be possible in some places that are built on very fertile soil with adequate water nearby in urban America. My first slide is just to show you the places I've had a chance to do a farm and food economy study around the United States and one province of Canada, which I didn't get in the map, but that was Manitoba. But the brown fields here are statewide studies I've had a chance to do. South Carolina included a $9.85 million investment plan for local foods that the state asked for and never has found a way to implement. But the green studies are smaller regional areas, usually coordinated by a local food network of some kind that wanted to take an economic view to agriculture and how to promote local food from an economic standpoint. And as you see, one of those studies was right here in this area where this campus stands. My first slide is a guy named Kurt Bench and his wife Karina. And I think he really represents some of the moment we're in today about agriculture in general, not simply urban agriculture, but I would argue that Kurt is an urban agriculturalist. Kurt has a great job with Archer Daniels Midland in Toledo, Ohio. And yet his grandfather was the best sweet corn producer in his county. And so people went to the farmer's market in Toledo looking for Kurt's grandfather's sweet corn because it was the best stuff around. Kurt could very easily keep in his job and have a good livelihood. He'd come home at 5 o'clock and enjoy his rural views and have it pretty easy. But he's decided instead to go back and buy his grandfather's farm, which is 400 acres, and start a 400-member CSA so he can deliver fresh vegetables to his neighbors. He, in fact, works his job at ADM so that he can hire 21 people part-time to manage his farm. And I think this is kind of an interesting place where we are, where a lot of the future we see developing in agriculture is coming out of a past that we're not quite comfortable with. Kurt's fellow employees say, you're doing the right thing, keep going. And having that support from a place that's really wrapped up in the commodity system, but also the freedom to move to a different way, is I think where a lot of us stand. We all have kind of one foot in both of those worlds. I think his family really stands for me as a metaphor of a lot of the complexity and the uncertainty we face as people in the urban ag issue. My first philosophy, I want to throw out a few ideas right now. I'm going to follow the American Planning Association definition of urban agriculture, which would include peri-urban areas. That includes a lot of landscape that we wouldn't talk about if we talked strictly about city limits, but I'm going to show you a lot of city plant projects as well. I do that partly because I think that it allows us a little freer choice about, do we focus on not simply urban areas and vertical farming, but can we talk about networks between urban livers and suburban and rural farmers? Can we talk about land? Can we not fight about whether this should happen only in cities or only in the countryside, but really talk about how those worlds could intersect? So that's my working definition. I was pleased to find this conference was located in a peri-urban area of Kansas City too, so I think I'll be in good comfortable terrain here. I also want to remind us that basically the attention to the food system involves all of us. We can talk about the economic actors that go around this circle, from farmers to aggregation, distribution, to waste recycling and so on, but also none of that works without healthy soil, with healthy water, good research that's appropriate to the production system we have, nonprofit organizations, technicians, health workers, energy that really is appropriate and renewable as well. So we really have a very complex story even talking about a food system, let alone the complexity of urban and rural. The main thing I'm going to really focus on today is that urban food systems, defined in that peri-urban, urban way, involve collaborative networks. And I'm increasingly finding in my work that I'm addressing the idea of how do we identify those networks, how do we strengthen those networks, build capacity within them. And guess what? If you do that over time, economic multipliers increase. And I think that that's something a lot of my economist colleagues are just beginning to figure out, if at all. So I really think that we're at a point where networks is a very solid way to talk about how we organize our production and our policy and our cogent thinking around urban agriculture. I could spend 20 minutes on the next slide, and I will not. But I also think it's really important. I had a farmer in Iowa, Matt Russell, kept encouraging me in the early days to say, you've got to tell people where you're coming from so they can compare their thoughts with yours. I have a vision for food systems, which is that they build in our communities health, wealth, connection, and capacity. You'll notice I'm not strictly talking about profits. And I'm actually arguing that our success is based on a system of visions and system of outcomes, not a single goal. And I think that's less dangerous terrain than trying to dumb it down to one simple approach or one simple measure of success. So I think this is really a good paradigm. In my normal speech, the one that Catherine saw in Holland, I basically had a half an hour to show that we were failing at all four of these counts. And I won't go there right now, but I think that's also kind of important to talk about where we really need this to end up in the long term. So this is the new book that just came out. I think it's available on Google Docs right now. I was hoping I might have a hard copy to wave in front of you, but it's apparently sitting on my front doorstep at this point. But if you start page 39, you'll see some of these same ideas, but I have better graphics in this presentation, so you have more visuals now. I was actually surprised. I was sitting in a car a few weeks ago driving with a young person, and I started talking about the city of Boston, which was founded in 1630, of course. And I was mentioning that there was a common grazing area in the city of Boston, which was formed in 1634, 4 years after the city was founded. And he said, what? And it's really interesting because we've had a history of, especially cities in the Eastern Seaboard, starting with agriculture and livestock being part of their construct, and we've totally forgotten that as a society today. So here's a map of the city in 1722. Obviously the Boston Common. I had a chance to live on Beacon Hill for 1 year, and that was a very nice way to be very close to a wonderful gathering point. It was formed in 1634, as I said. Here's a picture of the Boston Common probably in the 1700s, and notice there are cattle grazing on the commons because there was a common livestock grazing area. 1829, more cattle. The next year, cattle were prohibited from being on the common because I guess the sense had become that people were going to take over that space and no longer would be livestock. So a real huge change in the potential future of that city. But here, this very cosmopolitan, internationally connected city, really wrapped up in commodity flows that were global in the very early days in the 1600s, really saw a place for livestock being right in their city. In 1914, the Boston Children's Hospital was frustrated with the quality of milk they were getting from the commercial producers, so they put up their own cattle herd on the hospital to harvest milk for their patients. It suggests cattle and humans might be able to live together. I went to school near Philadelphia, and of course Philadelphia has a wonderful group of mappers who've been working hard at mapping out that city for a long time. Here's the city of Philadelphia. Notice this is what we now call Center City, Philadelphia. And look at the construct of this city as a place that is surrounded by farms, many of them owned by Quakers who also had a townhome in the city. So you have a whole concept of city life, which is planned by people who are farming the land and also living in townhomes, and think of that as a unified discussion, not as farmers versus urban people. A very different way of approaching lots of subjects. A little closer up view from a later map, and you see now you can identify not so much individual farms, but individual settlements that are surrounding the central city. Here's the downtown area. This is really where Philadelphia started when the Quakers first landed here, William Penn and so on. And if you look right here, you'll notice the farmers market. Why is it there? It's because products were easy to transport by river, either both from the sea and also from farms in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. They would come downtown, be offloaded off of a boat, and brought here to a market for people to buy. A later map of the city shows a larger market, and a later photograph shows what that market looked like. This is what, in 1859. Now in 1890 or so, the Reading Railroad decided to put up a new railroad terminal, and the site they wanted was actually where a lot of people were selling meats and cheeses and other food products, and the vendors said, we don't want to move. So the terminal actually built a market on ground level with a railroad station above, becoming Reading Terminal Market. This is the building that was formed, the offices of the railroad, the train cars coming in from the back, and then market stalls on the first floor so people could walk to the market. And guess what? That meant also that people could bring their products by train into the city to be sold to places. This is only 3 blocks away from the old market site, so it's kind of bringing that commerce all into one junction. Here's the railroad tracks, below that, the market. And I thought, I guess I was going to try to put in a contemporary picture of the market, but I was in college here in the 70s, and basically it was really bombed out at that point. It was very hard to even want to go in there, and now it's become more of a food court, prepared foods, a tremendous place to gather for social life, a real good focal point for tourism, where you have Amish growers bringing in their products and fresh foods, and a very good tumult. It's really going over a rapid transformation, but when I was there in the 70s, it was kind of a bleak looking place. So now a place of quite some transformation. This is something I just discovered in my research for this speech, but the city of Savannah had an urban plan in 1818, and this is quite remarkable. They focused on 10 units of housing in one little locale. They were sort of seen as people were supposed to live together in some kind of concert. There was a technical name for it I'll have in a slide in a minute, but connected to those were farmlands, and each household had an allocation of gardening plots at the outskirts of the city so they could garden food for themselves. As you notice, there was a city common as well, so there was a common place for raising livestock. And each family in each unit was assigned acreage of land outside the city for producing more commercial scale or larger scale crops like grains and so on. So an incredibly integrated vision of urban planning that said, we need homes, we need home gardens, kitchen gardens, we need farms, we need common livestock area, all as one part of a package. Imagine the vision behind that and how far we have gone from that potential. They call these 10 Hubs of Tithing. It was assigned a square mile tract outside of town, a 45-acre plot within that tract, and a 5-acre kitchen garden, and they trained together for militia duty. Well, this is a construct of urban life that says urban dwellers are the producers of their livelihood and the producers of their civilization, not simply consumers. A very different construct than we often suffer from today. This won't show you much hope for urban agriculture, but this is the city of Detroit, and I must add Windsor, because Wayne is here. I noticed that these were started, of course, as farms, because it was, like most American cities, good soil, water access, transportation access to the water, and people coming together because those elements that supported life were in one place. That's why most of our cities were started. And again, we've kind of gone from where that's really normal to some very different construct. That has morphed over time into the Detroit Eastern Market, which is again a place of incredible revitalization in the city of Detroit, where a historic market built, I think in 1882, where people could gather not to simply to get vegetables, but also 82 surrounding businesses surrounding the market, offering meats and restaurants and wholesalers and so on, now becoming an urban educational training center, research center, and a community kitchen for people to cook foods for each other. And here's the present day market and the historic market shed and some of the bedding plants that also show up in the spring. So it's also a very important place to get your flowers started and your vegetable sets. Also networked in with the greening in Detroit and the incredible effort for 1,600 or more community gardens across Detroit, which actually have a pickup truck picking up surplus product to sell to the school system to go into the school lunches. Again, a real testimony to what small-scale activity can be aggregated into a larger set of possibilities. Okay, I realized overnight that I should be careful not to equate this with the sit-in at the Capitol right now. But that's the White House. That's the National Mall. And during the Civil War, that was the grazing grounds for the cattle that fed the Union troops. And the reason we had a pasture in the National Mall was that it was relatively safe. It could be defended from invasion. It was a grassy area that was pretty humid, so it was actually pretty suitable for cattle. And it was also close to a rail line so that they could actually shift the cattle once they were processed from there to where the troops were deployed. This picture is the most amazing. That's the processing plant. It's right now where the Washington Monument stands. Was where the first processing plant in the mall was held, where these cattle were cut down and put into quarters or halves or whatever to ship on the rails. And as you see, the National Monument had not quite been completed at that point. But it's a little hard to see in these slides, but notice all the cattle grazing the mall. Probably a little bit of a romanticized version of that, but still very, very interesting. It's also very important for the economics of our current food system because this was the start of large-scale processing. Processing that many animals for the Union troops gave us the first requirement of having large-scale processing operations. This led to the growth of a processing industry nationally. So some of the larger feedlots, the larger processing companies had their start in the Civil War. This will not be the last time we'll see the war having a big impact on our agriculture. And I'm not going to talk about that today a lot, but it's a very interesting kind of another lesson on unexpected consequences, because the needs of really massing a lot of production in one place force a set of economic choices in the next few years. Returning to my home terrain of Minneapolis, this is a farm. I don't know if those of you recognize, this is the City Hall of Minneapolis, which still stands as a lovely building and now has some green roofs and a little bit of a paragon of green living in the city right now, thanks to our previous mayor. But in 1890, you can see a cornfield within eyesight of that City Hall. Again, urban agriculture is quite possible to do. Minnehaha Creek, a very small creek which I can paddle on a canoe if the water level is high enough today, had 6 grist mills built between this time period. And they basically all got knocked out when the large-scale milling industry that gave Minneapolis its wealth came in on the Mississippi River. But people in this day, they were limited by how far they could carry the grain from the farm to the mill and how far they could carry the grain from the mill to the consumer by horse travel and carts. And so the idea of centralizing in a pre-fossil fuel age was very difficult to pull off. A lot of centralization we heard about this morning is really due to our reliance on fossil fuels. And we may find, if we cannot rely on those in the future, that we're going to go back to some much more decentralized ways of thinking in the future. This railroad car is about a mile from the house I live in today. In 1915, a farm that is now a garden center, hauling fresh produce from the farm, from the fields to the carts, the train into downtown Minneapolis. We don't typically think of trains as a way of transporting vegetables today, but that was commonplace in an earlier, about 100 years ago. And a greenhouse, again, a mile from my house. And then modern day St. Paul Farmers Market. This is where the Hmong population established a foothold in the Twin Cities market. I was working for the market in 1981 when many growers were not happy. Hmong people were coming in to farm at all, did not like them coming to sell their products on the market. That discussion has been held over many decades, and now the majority of board members are Hmong. And now the Hmong population has established themselves as one of the primary groups producing fresh vegetables for the Twin Cities market. The presence of a market since 1853 has helped create a lot of that tension, a lot of those discussions, and some of the resolutions. A few other quick examples. Here's the West End Market in Cleveland. Historically, a farmer's market, now a little bit more oriented towards prepared food. Findlay Place Market in Cincinnati, where a farmer donated land to the city so they would have a public market on the outskirts of town so farmers could bring their products in from the suburban areas and shoppers could come and meet them there. A great example of peri-urban and urban collaboration in Cincinnati. Once again, an old historic market now being refurbished, revitalized, and the market has, you'll see in a minute, the market has its own farms in urban Cincinnati where they're producing food that can be sold at the market as well. Looking at California, the best farmland in California is now Silicon Valley. And this is a real tremendous dilemma for the state of California, the largest farm state and the most, the most prosperous farm state in the country, has given up most of its farmland for development that's really very intensively housing. And that makes California a net importer of food, even though most of us rely heavily on California for a lot of products that we eat. In sum, we've extracted considerable wealth from rural America, from rural areas to finance urban expansion, paving over those visions of Savannah that would be a farming community as well as an urban community, paving over the, not the commons in Boston, but a lot of the farmable areas outside of Boston, paving over a lot of the suburbs of Philadelphia, and getting rural farmers so dependent on an urban economy that they lost their ability to create wealth. And for those of you who had a chance to visit rural America, to see Main Street stores that have closed down, to see the beautiful courthouses built 100 years ago when people had a vision of rural America being a place that was internationally desirable and competitive, and see all that go away because our farming system, our food system has taken such wealth out of rural America. So now the places where our farms are have trouble responding to the demand for food because they don't have the investment capital, they've lost some of the land. Youth have become an export crop, and so many youth are no longer interested in living or able to live in the small towns where they grew up. A very imbalanced system, to be sure. Well, one small effort to kind of think about food different way in urban areas was the Victory Garden movement during World War II. Once again, an impact of war on our food ways. My father was a victory gardener in Minneapolis during the war, and he took out 2 city plots that were not built upon. They since have sprouted houses, but he was gardening intensively because he came from a farm, and that was something he could do very well, and he raised vegetables and gave them to the neighbors. It was his way of decompressing from a government job and also building a sense of community where he lived. But also more interesting was there were 20 million such gardens across the country during World War II, not starting simply by random startups, by government programs encouraging people, posters like this saying, plant food. If you don't plant food, you're not going to eat. And in fact, in 1943, 40% of all the produce eaten in the United States came from gardens such as these, according to a US Navy count. A real testament to the fact that small-scale activity, if well coordinated and well articulated, can really have immense impacts. I don't think we could mount such a campaign today. We've lost too many skills, we've lost too much land, and if we have a similar crisis, according to some of the things that you mentioned earlier, we might have real trouble responding in the way that we could in 1940, 41, 42. Okay, the next few slides are sort of a really quick race through some urban projects. These are all within city limits of some city in the United States. And I just want to run through them fast to say, here's a little wealth of activity that's going on already that looks back to some of this tradition and also looks ahead in a very interesting way. Jackie and his wife Dora King in Flint, Michigan. Jackie's a karate instructor, and he teaches that part of being a karate student and defending yourself is to grow your own food. That's actually a vision that could be compared nicely with the Savannah vision of city planning in 1818. But basically, self-reliance and self-determination and democracy is about some manual skills, but also about knowing food. Here's the greenhouse at the Harvesting Earth Farm that Jackie runs and trains inner city youth about how to garden and be cogent about self-defense in a very trying urban place. And we've heard a lot about the water issues there that are kind of showing us how we should pay more attention to water as well. Mansfield Fraser in Cleveland has to start what he calls the vineyards of Chateau Houf, which is in the intersection where Cleveland had riots in 1968 during the anti-poverty eruption, or actually the anti-poverty, but the urban eruption of the late 60s. He's planted grapes, and he's going to make wine with those grapes, and he's going to have an urban wine. And of course, who does he bring in to work the fields? Youth from the neighborhood. He lives on this corner, so he's very watchful of the farm. But the youth working in the farm are part of the defense system of the community because they are watching the streets. So when I came up to interview Mansfield about his farm, everybody noticed my car as soon as it came across the corner because they are watchful of the streets. They're out there working on a daily way. They get some people released from prison to work in the farm. It creates a real sense of community and possibility, as well as producing a product that will result in a fairly high value thing, all produced within an urban setting, in fact, an inner city setting. This is the Findlay Place Garden in Cincinnati, recalling the market slide I had earlier, that they just started a farm so they could be involved with urban youth in their neighborhood and they could have a product to sell at the market itself. This is a guy whose name I've forgotten because he sort of didn't want the publicity, but he was running a 5 or 6 acre farm within the city limits of Cincinnati, and he'd been selling to independent grocers for years, and as those became consolidated grocers by larger corporations, he felt he lost his markets. So he's now running a UPIC operation as well as farming. And the folks in Cincinnati said, how do we keep that land being productive farmland in the face of development pressure in the fringes of Cincinnati? And that question was not resolved when I was there in 2012, and I would doubt it has been today. But again, there are farms inside city limits that have been producing for a long, long time. The Enright Ridge Urban Eco Village in Cincinnati is a group of neighbors that have just allocated their own backyards to sharing production, sharing farming skills, and sharing seeds. And this is a slide I took in 2012. They also have a very wonderful greenhouse and a lot of tool sharing, a lot of sort of local capacity building around this process. This is a farm within the urban limits of Fort Wayne, Indiana. And this is really run by an engineer who's, he's a really good techno geek in a lot of ways. And he's been thinking about how to make things more efficient. So he developed a trellising system for berries where you have a trellis set up and you grow the berries, but when they start, when they're ready to bear fruit, you actually lay that trellis down on the ground like this. So all the berries are raised on the sunny side of that plant. When you want to harvest, you raise that trellis up off its hinge and all the berries are on one side. You've cut your harvesting time in half. You've also doubled productivity because you've really fertilized that very well. A very intensely interesting system for producing berries. They're organic, they're high quality. He's marketing around pretty broadly around the Midwest and through a California broker. He shared with me the network of growers that he works with. He says they're mostly Amish because the Amish have land, skills, and capital that a lot of English folks don't have. All the way to Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, Oklahoma, and look at the network he's built within Indiana itself. I was doing a study for the economic development community in Northeast Indiana. They gave me some time to map some of these projects. And what I liked about this map was it showed a lot of growers in that region growing food. The one gap in this map is that very few of those berries are available for sale within Fort Wayne or within even suburban Indiana grocery stores because they tend to go far away to bigger metro areas where there's more money and more established marketing channels. So not simply producing a high quality product is not enough, but also connecting that with infrastructure, with local efficiencies in trade and local commitment from buyers. But this is a national production system that's been started on a farm within the city limits of Fort Wayne. A tremendous visioning process as well as a production process. The food bank in Tucson runs this farm as a training farm for low-income people and others in Tucson who want to learn how to farm. And again, this land gave me pause when I saw it coming from Minnesota as I do. And yet they're farming organically in this land. It's within the city limits of Tucson. And it's a tremendous effort by the food bank to say we're not simply about handing out food, we're about empowering the people that we work with to gain new productive skills and to participate in the economy in a richer way. Portland, Oregon has a very wonderful network of community gardens. I got to visit them at a food security conference a number of years ago. I've come to Nashville for several years to work with the good folks in Nashville. Really interesting dilemma where this whole area of Nashville, called Bell's Bend, is within the city limits. It's beautiful farmland, and it's totally threatened by development. Some developers wanted to put in a high-rise condominium, and luckily the folks who live there, who are small farmers trying to reestablish a local agriculture, and some allies and architects and others who have bought homes there because it's a nice rural place to live, were able to stop that for a while. At the same time, here's land that's already within the city, that's already producing food. It's actually across the river from downtown Nashville, hard to get to because of freeways, but could be a tremendous destination within the city of Nashville for producing food, for celebrating food, for eating really high quality, locally produced meals. And it's very hard to find vision in the city itself of people who want to make that reality a possibility for the future. Golden, Colorado has a network of these little shipping containers fitted with an air conditioner so that for some of the CSA farmers, they can deliver their CSA share to this box that has a combination on the side so the buyer can pick up product that's been stored at a cool temperature. I think you can see over there, there's a, oh, you can't see it, but there's a monitor making sure the temperature stays constant and cool over time. And it allows people to transfer food without having to make that personal connection every time they do it. I like the personal connection, but also sometimes you have a busy life and you just want to drop it off there. So a great reuse of a shipping container and a great reuse of kind of local infrastructure that helps connect farmers and consumers in new ways. Here's a farm inside the city limits of Tupelo, Mississippi. Young couple that just decided they wanted to farm and raise food for the local markets, and scored a really beautiful piece of property that other farmers in the area thought was worthless. But they found that vegetables work really well there. Growing Power in Chicago, I don't need to say much about Growing Power, but here's a hoop house inside city limits where people are raising food and learning food skills in an inner city setting. Growing Power also, of course, has its home in Milwaukee as well. A lot of you know Greensgrow Gardens, which used to be one of my kind of keynote presentations. The Greensgrow Gardens is a 1-acre farm in Central City, Philadelphia. Mary Seton Corboy and her husband started this about 25 years ago. Got some help from federal grants, but the last I checked in, maybe 4 years ago, they were selling $1 million worth of product off a 1-acre farm in Central City, Philadelphia. Not all product they raised themselves, but they were bringing in product from a wide variety of farms around the area who would bring their product into the city, store it at their farm, or broker it through this farm to 40 restaurants that are in walking distance from this farm. And also selling landscaping products, which actually is where most of their money comes from, but they're helping the neighborhood fix itself up with more landscaping by being a presence and being a skill set that can help intrude in this urban setting. It's really quite beleaguered. I actually student taught in this neighborhood when I was in college, and it was the teacher I worked for as a science teacher carried a baseball bat with him at all moments in the school day. And it's a really big difference to see this new way of interacting in the city. Hydroponic production on raised platforms. The Food Project in Boston has done a lot of work to really focus on training youth in not only gardening, but also cooking. Spawned some farms in urban areas in Boston. And this is not farming, but I couldn't resist, maybe because Wayne was coming, I'm not sure, but I had to bring a little Canadian process too. But this is the public market in Montreal called Marché Jean Talon. And this is about a 4 square block area devoted to buying fresh produce and some prepared foods. I can't really give it justice with the photos I've got, but folks there are masters at presenting very high quality products that come from farms not far from Montreal. They're sold for a pretty good price, but it's also a tremendous food gathering point for the city. Fayetteville has, like many communities, a co-op grocery store with not only fresh produce, but also photos of the farmers on the wall, so you can really tell the places your product came from. You can compare what the label says with the practices they have on their website and your chance to visit the farm. So these gathering points between farmer and consumer are also very crucial. The food bank in Fort Wayne has gotten donations to invest $5 million to take over an old commercial kitchen building and make it a community processing kitchen for inner city Fort Wayne. These stoves were donated by a local company that makes one of the best stoves in the country, and they wanted to have this facility have those. Their first product was to buy potatoes and sweet corn from local farms so they could freeze those and prepare those for handy, freeze them in the fall harvest time and give them out in February and March when those things are very rare to find. They're now talking about taking the berries from those trellis berries I mentioned and freezing those for later use or for sale to school system, what have you. It gives the facility, that gives the community a facility to make choices like that about which foods they want to produce for themselves. So my question that really led my chapter was, how would any city survive in the future, especially given limited fossil fuel resources, if it doesn't grow its own food, at least in close proximity, as we find ourselves less and less able to transport long distances. And we find the system we built that's very efficient at transporting food very long ways really kind of falls apart from us. I'm kind of famous for my data about the farm economy. I just want to give you a few highlights of the national story for farming in the United States, just to show a little bit of sort of economic issues that drive our situation today. This is the last 100 years of farming in the United States as expressed by data that the Economic Research Service compiles about all the farmers in the US. And we show in the orange line the farm sales, maroon line, the production expenses. And as you see, sales have risen to record levels, but the expenses rise as fast as the income does. So every time farmers make a little bit more money, the system kind of takes that away from them. This is the net cash income, which is subtracting the expenses from the cash return. Notice that in 2015, all the farmers in the United States spent more producing their products than they got from the market. And USDA currently predicts that corn farmers in the Midwest will lose $95 per acre of corn they produce this year. And they say that's likely to stay the same for about 8 years. Can someone show me sustained growth in agriculture in the United States from this chart? Arguably, we are the most advanced productive nation in the world. We have invested heavily in subsidies, in technology, in infrastructure to make this system fine. And it really, as I mentioned before, sucks wealth away from rural America in a very sustained way. If you adjust this data for inflation, you see very different patterns from the same numbers. But what I think is most remarkable is we have money coming into the farm economy when Europe is bombed out after World War II, and we loan money to Europe so they can buy products from our farms, and that means our farms make a little money for a while. It falls away. Russia has a crop failure in 1973, and they decide to buy grain, wheat and corn primarily from American farmers because they have dollars and we need dollars because we're buying oil at huge prices. So we have a peak in 1973 when momentarily farmers make a lot of money, and that dies away as soon as the Soviets stop buying. 2008, as we heard earlier this morning, speculators who had lost their shirts in the housing market, and the housing market collapsed in 2008, look for some commodity they can invest in. That turns out to be grain. It gives farmers a nice little bump, which leads again to further decline. No sign of sustainability in this farm economy financially, even though it's so well incentivized by tax laws and everything else. Here's the value of food that US farmers have reserved for their own use at home since 1949. It used to be a $20 billion industry. Over time, farmers themselves have been convinced they can get better food at the grocery store than growing their own. And that's gone down to almost zero. These last two slides take the same data, adjusted for inflation, comparing the non-metro counties of the United States, that's this one, with the metro counties, which will be the next one. So, metro counties include some farmland. It's going to be a metro area because it'll be considered a metropolitan statistical area and considered more urban than rural. But it's very interesting to look at this data broken out by that way. This is since 1969. The same patterns show up in the data. This is non-metro US. This is metro US. Notice the returns for farmers are not good in either place. They're pretty much the same. We have the same economic infrastructure in both places. And yet, it's a little bit better for metro US than for non-metro. There's something perhaps magical about connecting with your consumers and growing food for people you know and having that connection be close, rather than simply cranking out commodities for export and importing the food that you eat. And this financial data would say that right now, urban areas are a better place to raise food than many rural areas we have. One further thing I want to go off onto, and then I think I'm going to have to stop for questions. But we talked about the grain for oil trades in 1973. What happened when the Soviet Union stopped buying grain precipitously? We had stockpiles of corn here around Kansas that we could not sell. The price of corn was very cheap, and we had a new enzyme process that made it very inexpensive to raise, to create high fructose corn sweetener. Oops, I've gone ahead myself. In 1973, our use of high fructose started rising. Our use of sugar declined. Overall sweetener use was pretty steady, so we replaced one form of sugar for the other. The next year, we started noticing our kids getting overweight. And the following 2 years later, we noticed adults breaking out in an epidemic of obesity. And I say this again to show the connections between farming and eaters. Inner city kids who wrestle with obesity are victims of an oil crisis in 1973 in a very real way. And we could talk for hours about whether this is causal, and I don't want to really suggest that I could make that case today, but I do work with nutritionists who say there's a pretty strong correlation between use of high fructose corn sweetener and obesity. And the reason they say that is this, that if I have something with sugar in it, there's an enzyme in my body telling me, stop, Ken, you've had enough. I have no such biological signal when it comes to high fructose sweetener, so it's very easy to have one more can of something, one more portion. And this is an example of a product that's not genetically modified, not a high-tech product. It's something we considered safe in 1972 when we started putting in our food supply that we didn't know the consequences of. But I think, again, that's why, as you mentioned so well this morning, we're so complicated as a food system that I actually believe that very local action helps us take more power over that, because we can see the consequence of our action. We can actually know the people who suffer from our choices, and we can make better policy in the future. I hope what I've shown is that the key is not how to produce food in urban America. It's how do we build the infrastructure that supports that process and makes that one that actually builds health, wealth, connection, and capacity for our consumers. And, oh, okay, 4 more slides. I see a lot of people pushing us to go to scale, saying that scale is, we have to get to scale to get efficiency. We've doubled efficiency in the last 40 years when farm income has stayed constant. Efficiency by itself is not enough. We need perhaps agriculture that's less efficient, more rewarding in the future. Scale for me is a strategy, not a purpose. And I see a lot of people in this movement suggesting it's a purpose for our work, and I think that's a misleading thing, again, for some of the complexity that I talked about before. We need systems that build market power for farmers. We've all heard the stories of the farmer that sells to a large firm who sells really wonderfully for 6 months and then says, and the firm comes back and says, we want $1 less a pound. And without that market power, without farmers being price setters instead of price takers, no system will be sustainable for the producers. And what really, I'll close with saying that what really differentiates what I call local food is it builds community connections. That is the hardest thing to rip off from all the work we're doing, is the chance to really connect around community, to build together health, wealth, connection, and capacity, not simply move products through a system that's very efficient. I will stop with that because I want some time for discussion, but thank you very much.
Again, if you'd like questions, please wait for the microphone. And do we have any questions for Ken or comments?
Price your book's gonna come down. It's $159 on Amazon.
Yeah, I haven't tried to buy one. I think you can actually download chapter by chapter for free, is from what I can tell from Google Docs. But I didn't have, I mean, it's not my book. and I can make the chapter available to other people, I'm pretty sure.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. It's very eye-opening. I am an assistant city manager with Kansas City, Missouri, and we do also have an area that used to be farmed. That's where our prison was, our tuberculosis hospital, women's reformatory, and what have you. We're in the process of trying to repurpose that back to agriculture and have a community garden there, an organization called Boys Grow. We hopefully will have a greenhouse farm there as well. Can you give us some tips and tricks to get this done? It seems like it's going very, very slow, and I'm okay with that. But then there's others, some of my council persons, my boss, the city manager, really want to see things move more quickly. How can that give me give me the magic?
Well, my impression is that Kansas City is really leading the country in a lot of ways about this civic discussion around agriculture because of groups like Cultivating Communities, and I don't want to pick them out as the only place, but that's what I know the best. And I think that one comment I would make is a colleague of mine 40 years ago said everyone should know how to garden because that's how they learn about process. And part of the problem is that we have people who think that if you put this many $1 million out, you're going to get a really fast response. And gardening and food teach us to slow down, for one thing. But I also believe that you can move that process faster with some concerted planning. You can start thinking about how many vegetables, like how many green peppers and potatoes do we need to feed this population, and how much land would that require? And really, how do we maybe write some RFPs where we say, if you can produce food for us, we will pay you a certain amount of money for producing that. I know most of my colleagues who are planners wouldn't do that if somebody didn't pay them. And yet we expect farmers to do that on a risky basis when they have no possible assurance of future work. So I think that we have to think about maybe we want to put out more proposals for producing food and fewer for planning food systems. And I'm saying that as a food system planner. But we need a little bit of both, but we also need to think about, let's mobilize resources, let's get clever about this planning, let's get targeted, and let's move forward in a more, I think that the main thing is to be trusting and unified. Building that trust does take time in the early days, and those communities that pull it off go the furthest.
So from your economist perspective, what on like a government or a federal level, what kind of policy and economic changes do we need to make to do this shift from our current industrial system to more of an urban one?
It's hard to ask the policy question in Washington, D.C. right now, as you know. And I think, I think we have some really good openings with USDA where you have the Agricultural Marketing Service taking on really knowing what's happening in the ground in lots of communities and starting to say, how do we kind of intervene in this as a federal agency to really make better stuff happen? And I think the concept of food hubs has been way oversold by that agency, but I think I also see them opening up space now for saying the value of this is more about coordinating a local network and not so much about putting a business in place that may not pay for its own way. A government that has people who know what's happening community by community is more effective than one that sort of sets a policy that's supposed to apply blanket across all the United States. I think that's a good step forward. The USDA is tracking produce sales again, which they had stopped doing because the industry thought it was too inefficient for a while, and now it's kind of coming back as a thing they measure more carefully. Obviously, the federal money is coming in our communities, sometimes badly spent, but having federal dollars, especially when the local government really doesn't get it, where you can say, let's do a food plan, let's do a food system assessment, let's do a business plan for whether food hub really can pay its own way before we put up the building. Those are incredibly important to have. So I would really like to see us put much more money into that pipeline so that most communities could count on having access to capital in a fairly easy way, where the federal government is actually investing in a local vision and leveraging local resources, not strictly a match, but really leveraging what the local community wants to do instead of imposing more restrictions. And I wrote many years ago about the need to have a farm policy shaped by community food systems rather than by commodities. And that's the fundamental shift we have to undertake.
I have a question about the transfer container with air conditioning. One of the things that small producers are concerned about. The small producers are concerned about is labor and delivery and keeping up with their customers. Can you elaborate on how successful or not or beneficial
I'll repeat the question if I can, because the microphone wasn't working, but for the benefit of people in the other room. The question was that the container system in Golden, Colorado really benefit the producers in a meaningful way. Is it just a nice slide of my show? And I don't have the answer for that question because I was in town for a total of 3 hours. But what I think I'd say is that this was actually designed by the growers and by the people who are networking the growers to say the growers have a limitation getting their product to their consumers, and this is one way of addressing that issue. And they seem to be not only using them, but also have plans to put like 10 more in place. So my suspicion is that they view it as a friendly technology, and when they stop viewing it that way, they'll come up with something better.
Okay, let's thank Ken. We're getting close to noon.
Thank you.